So them going to URC, that could lead to domination from a South African perspective.
Some of the benefits of cohesive teams, whether it's systems and processes in place, is that you actually get accelerated skill development.
If people think that performance is about heart and pride in the jersey and just purely skill and tactics, that is only a very small percentage. Beautiful triangle where it all points to that black jersey at the top. Yep. But it's fundamentally driven by NPC.
There's been a lot of talk about the NPC being not fit for purpose. You could almost argue it is fit for purpose.
It can either go in two directions. It could either completely muck it up, or it can actually absolutely even optimize it further.
Kia ora everyone, my name's Zach. I love rugby. Welcome back to Haka Time Rugby. Today I'm joined by Simon Strachan from Gainline Analytics. Very excited to have you here today, Simon. I suppose anyone who's followed the channel for an extended period of time knows that I'm someone who likes to get into detailed analysis, strategy, tactics, and data. So having yourself here is very exciting to me. There's a lot of concepts around cohesion, other things that I've heard a lot of in recent years. So hoping we can dive into that, and welcome and thank you for joining.
Zach, thank you very much for having me. And yes, hopefully we can delve into a few things as we go.
Yeah, I guess just for the general audience, do you want to give a quick intro, maybe a little bit about Gainline Analytics and just a quick overview there?
Yeah, so Gainline Analytics is, but basically we're a sport and corporate data analytics consultancy business. We started as a business around, I co-founded the business with Ben Darwin. So Ben Darwin, former Wallaby Brumby, he started the business when he returned from a coaching stint in Japan in about 2013, and I joined up with him in 2015. Ben and I met when I was a performance analyst at the Wallabies, and he had just came on board when the Rebels were first starting up. So he was literally sort of third person in the door, and he asked me if I could help. And so we were in an office somewhere in Security Road, clipping the first squad of the Melbourne Rebels back in 2010. Yep. That's when we first met. And so when he came back from a coaching stint in Japan, he said, I've got an idea for a business. And he was actually putting together a database. It was a player availability database. So the idea of the business was that clubs could come to Ben and say, when's the flanker coming off contract? Instead of sort of going out to their network. So it could be a sort of a shop front for player availability. But what happened was that when we started putting the database together, we noticed that the way teams recruited was sort of against the traditional model of performance. So teams that recruited highly skilled players weren't necessarily performing in the way that people expected. And teams that didn't necessarily recruit or recruited a certain type of player were actually performing better than expected. And this kind of coincided with Ben's own experience of playing for the Brumbies and playing for the Wallabies in the golden era, as it's kind of described as in the late 90s and early 2000s. And sort of this resonated with him to say, I always felt I wasn't necessarily a better player than, say, the Kiwis were when we were winning Bledisloe Cups. There was something about the way the team was put together. But what he could see was, because Ben is an absolute pattern person. So, and he will, he's talked about this. He was diagnosed as an adult with ADHD. So he sees patterns everywhere. And he could see this pattern in the way recruiting was driving performance. And so we actually overlaid it. One of the original founding members of Gainline, Pat Ferguson, that went on to do a PhD at Harvard, is now a professor at Melbourne University, overlaid this with some of the first markers of cohesion analytics and the first markers, TWI or Teamwork Index, of how to measure this recruiting and how organizations or teams recruit in a certain way. And this related very much to performance. So from that, we've basically built the business around that, from looking at how organizations recruit, how it from a governance perspective influences recruiting, all the way down to a granular level of in-game performance when it comes to the concepts of what we call cohesion. Now, cohesion is an objective level of understanding between the participants on the team. So when we use the word cohesion, it's not social cohesion. It's not whether people like each other or not. It's really an objective measure of understanding. So a trigger warning for anyone watching in: if people think that performance is about heart and pride in the jersey and just purely skill and tactics, that is only a very small percentage, if at all, about performance, especially at the pointy end. We know the skill differential at the pointy end of professional sports quite small. The cohesion differential, the level of understanding or the way teams are put together, is actually quite significant. And that is a very significant driver. Teams or organisations that can develop that understanding have a much better ability to perform. And we know this from our data. Our data is very objective driven. There's no subjectivity in it. We basically gather our data, which is in the public domain. We put it into our supercomputer and it pops out the data, and the numbers are the numbers are the numbers. High performing teams have strong cohesion markers. Low performing teams have low cohesion markers. And it's not because they're low performing, it's just that they haven't necessarily been put together very well. And that's reflected in the cohesion markers in that way.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So a lot of what you're talking about is really sort of data-driven analysis on cohesion. And I found what was quite interesting when I really looked into it is that, you know, some of the benefits of cohesive teams, whether it's systems and processes in place, is that you actually get accelerated skill development. So that was something that I wasn't expecting, I guess, when I started looking into it. And it was this idea that, well, you don't necessarily need to recruit for talent. Maybe you're recruiting it for fit or for alignment to a system. And then through that, you can get accelerated skill development of individuals.
Yeah, and that's very, very true. So it's the old cliche, a champion team is better. A champion team is better than a team of champions. I don't think I've got that cliche right, but it's basically when you have a high cohesion environment, it enables players to play to capacity or beyond capacity in a way, because they're not necessarily worrying about, I'm not learning how the person next to me is playing. I can now work on my own detail as a player. The classic example we use in our workshops is Smith, Cronk, and Slater at the Melbourne Storm. Brisbane Norths, through to the Melbourne Storm, through to Queensland, through to the Kangaroos. Guys that had spent so much time together, they could work on the absolute detail when they were playing together. And so, like, they literally those blokes cost $5,000 when they got the first NRL contract, and now they're immortals in that way. I use this example that you talk about the Crusaders, you know, seven Super Rugby titles in a row. And, you know, we do some work with the Crusaders. I'm still struggle to name their back row each week. And even though we look at them each week, because they do their job and they do their job well, but they're not out and out stars in that way. Yes, absolutely, they produce stars, and there's no question about it. But you put some of those players in other franchises, and the question is, would they perform the same way? There's an expression in Europe called the Bayern Munich mirage. You take a player out of Bayern Munich, a very successful German football team, and they play for other teams. They don't necessarily perform as well because the system, the cohesion in Bayern Munich is quite high. In Australia, we use a similar term, the Melbourne Storm mirage. You take a player out of Melbourne Storm, they don't necessarily play the same way. Conversely, you have the Nemani Nadolos go to the Crusaders and perform quite well. You have other players go to high cohesion environments, they get to perform well. Conversely, players leave those environments, they don't necessarily perform as well. So, I mean, and Roger Tuivasa-Sheck's a really good example of an absolute there's no question he's an out-and-out athlete, fantastic feat, but you've got to develop levels of understanding with his teammates to allow him to play to capacity, and he was never really given that chance. And then, you know, returned back to rugby league. Hopefully he plays enough with people he's already played with back at the Warriors to really allow him to play to capacity.
See, that's a really interesting example, because what you have someone there who came from sort of Dally M in the rugby league circles into rugby union, sort of, I guess, relearning his trade to a degree, but where you have systems in place like the Crusaders, let's say, for example, do you think, if we just take that example, do you think a Crusaders type environment would support a recruitment like of that type of player? Or is it more, it's better to go with a player that better fits the system?
Well, you asked the question, but of course Lee Halfpenny has been recruited by the Crusaders. So high cohesion environments, whether that's at Crusaders or Leinster or the Melbourne Storm, they can absorb a limited number of these high external recruits, but it depends what position it is, though. So I'll give you an example. In Super Rugby, in Super Rugby, only one franchise has ever won a Super Rugby title with an externally developed first five. What I mean by externally developed, either that played their first professional game at another Super Rugby franchise. So only one Super Rugby since '96. So because first five, 5'8", fly half, depending where you come from and what part of the world you're from, is a highly relational position. So to play to capacity and do the right things, you've basically got to spend time in there in that way. So it depends on the relationship. So obviously Pablo Matera, quite a loose position. Nemani Dodolo at the end of a chain. You can do that. Lee Halfpenny, backfield, it starts to become more of a relationship position. That's where, say, for example, the Highlanders last year, if anyone saw Freddie Burns play, from set piece, yes, he's okay. But from general play, it was quite difficult for him to get into the rhythm because of that level of understanding that they needed. So again, this year with Reece Patchell, will be a really interesting scenario of how they absorb him into their team for this year.
Yep, very interesting. So how do you measure, I guess, just broadly the concepts of cohesion? How do you measure cohesion with the team? I have seen something called a teamwork index. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more and how you sort of measure cohesion?
Yeah. So we basically, teamwork index, or TWI, is a measure of how the squad's put together. So it's a function of player history over time, but it's influenced by a number of different factors, such as structure. It's influenced by the structure, how players come through the system. It's influenced by size. It's influenced by position. And the positional example I talked about, sort of high relationships, we talked about Super Rugby teams and successful Super Rugby teams and the first five where they came from, for example. And so TWI as a measure measures the squad, and we measure that at the beginning of the season. It's a measure of the overall organization's recruitment philosophy. And in the cruder sense, are we a build organization or are we a buy organization? Do we develop from within, or do we bring in externally developed talent? TWI as a measure is an indicator of the ability of a team to produce cohesion in game. And so in game, it's basically how much cohesion or how much understanding does a team have for that 80 minutes that they play. And that's a function of TWI. Now, TWI is produced over multiple seasons, so multiple decision making, because you're going to have guys that are going to be in the squad for 11, 12, 13 years in some cases, and of course new recruits. So there's a long-term decision making process that makes up TWI. But of course in game is like, well, who are we going to select this week? So when you see a line break or a missed tackle, the punter in the stand might look at that as a skill deficiency. We look at it and say, okay, what's the cohesion relationship of that team, especially in those basically combinations that let that line break in? Is the cohesion relationship weak? Is it weak? Yes, it is weak. Why is it weak? What decision in the organisation was made this year, last year, 5 years ago that created that relationship? What is the function of the structure underneath the organisation that has created that in that way? So that's ultimately the way we look at it and the way cohesion analytics work. So we've got a database of over 70,000 games of professional rugby. So we know where every player has played and in what position they've played. So we know basically effectively every relationship when someone plays professional rugby. So if they've played for Auckland via the MLR, via Japan, via the Premiership, via the URC, via the All Blacks, etc., we basically have that in our database. But with the markers come what we call practices and principles. So having the numbers is one thing. Understanding what the numbers, how you read or understand what you're seeing on the pitch, for example. So say the All Blacks Bledisloe 1 versus Bledisloe 2. Yep. The All Blacks sent a really strong team from a marker's perspective to Melbourne against a relatively low Wallabies team, and they won whatever it is, 31 points.
Comfortably, yep.
Then they had a home game in Dunedin, and on the face of it, you go, well, that's a pretty strong team because you've got half Chiefs, half Crusaders, roughly. Two teams that played off in the Super Rugby final. So from a skill perspective, this must be pretty good. But the way it was constructed, it meant the team was actually quite fragile from a defensive and an execution standpoint by our numbers. And that kind of played out in the way the game was. So it was like a 3-point win at home is not necessarily what you'd expect. And so having the numbers, but then understanding how that plays out. And the reason we know that is basically when you've got 30 plus years of data, you can analyze what do the numbers reflect on the game outcome from that perspective. So, and it doesn't always happen. Sometimes games go against the numbers. So, I don't know if you can remember, Highlanders beat the Crusaders maybe 3 years ago in a game. Completely, no one picked it, and it was completely against the numbers. It was one of those things, and we get a few of these, but it is rare. But when it happens, it means we learn from it. What can we learn from these scenarios? So.
Well, you've started on the All Blacks, so I think we'll dive straight into it around their Rugby World Cup performance. So obviously beaten finalists there. Close game, 12 points to 11.
Yeah.
A close quarterfinal as well up against Ireland. And all of the talking points around the top 4 teams have been, it comes down to moments. There's not much between them. But then you also look at the All Blacks, and I look at sort of in the lead up. They've chopped and changed selections quite significantly in the lead up to the Rugby World Cup. There were a couple of big performances where I think they set markers. There's Johannesburg last year, the Wallabies game you mentioned this year. So from my point of view, there was always sort of a core team that if they were able to get them on the field, they'd be extremely competitive. We saw that against Ireland. But from a cohesion perspective, what was your take on the construct of that All Blacks team and how they sort of built up towards the World Cup?
Look, it probably couldn't have been much better than what it was. So there was that 18-month, 2-year period where I think it was a case of we're 2 years out from the World Cup, so let's have a look what's going on. But as far as the World Cup final goes, it was from our numbers perspective, it was literally a coin toss. South Africa were really strong. The All Blacks were really strong. And so it was going to come down to who could execute the best, or who could keep 15 people on the pitch, or who could make their kicks. So, in the end, it was going to always, from our perspective, it was always going to be very close because there were 2 teams at the absolute, from a numbers perspective, at the top of the game. And so, from a context perspective, it was a really good contest because the quality of essentially the cohesion of the 2 teams were really, really high. It was similar to I was in Hamilton in May this year for the Chiefs game, and then obviously watching the Super Rugby final. They were absolutely 2 quality games because there were 2 quality teams. Basically the 2 highest cohesion teams in Super Rugby, and that's what you get when you have 2 teams that can execute, got a high level of understanding, can defend really well and execute really well. Get these quality outcomes, even not massively scoring, but it is an absolute contest.
I've got another question here. So if we look at 2 teams, the All Blacks and the way they sort of approach this final, some of it was, they approach their run in the World Cup. You look at Ireland as well, and you probably look at it that, on the Irish front, they had, the same team throughout the World Cup. You look at other teams where it is, they almost go into a World Cup with a view of, we're going to use that 8-week period that we get together to really sort of build combinations where we need to and drive a performance when it matters. So how do you measure that sort of short-term ability of teams to build cohesion for big moments like that in a World Cup? Like, how much weighting do you put on that? Because it seems to be a strategy a lot of teams are using.
Well, it's partly because we don't, from our perspective, we don't necessarily weight it any different about what sort of period of time. But the great thing about the World Cup, it's a bit of a leveler for everybody because teams do get a period of time together, which generally they don't. And so what we do, we've got this term called back ending. So when teams do get a period of time together, they get some stability. And so they do get some level of capacity at the end because they get actually a good period of time when they can be consistent. We're generally out of the maybe the top 8 or the 6 nations and the Rugby Championship. Most other test teams just don't get quality long periods of games, and so this is their only opportunity to have that period of time and back end with it. So and so it does have a leveling effect. So sometimes it's not about the overall strength of how strong you are, but it's the lack of weakness of teams, so the consistency of relationships through the group. And that's what back-ending allows you to do. So some teams through the World Cup become better because of the basically developing that consistency. And with the consistency comes the ability to execute and the ability to defend.
Yep. And examples there, Wales to a degree, England obviously made it to a semi-final, were highly competitive. I suppose Fiji's a slight sort of bit of difference because obviously they had the lead up with the Fiji and Drua, and then some consistency sort of through the World Cup. But those sort of short, sharp timeframes of tournaments seem to be a bit of a leveling effect there.
Yeah, like I look back to 2011 Rugby World Cup where, France gets beaten by Tonga.
Right, yeah.
But then they make the final. There's probably some other examples. Or the classic example for me, and when we always talk about games, it's always focusing on context. There's always a winner. There's a winner and loser, and obviously the winner gets all the plaudits and the loser's not talked about much. But it's always about context. So 2015, the Brighton Miracle, when Japan beat South Africa. So our numbers actually had Japan better than South Africa. So for us, it wasn't an outlier of a game. Maybe you play the game 10 times and South Africa wins 7 or 8 and Japan 2 or 3. But Japan always had the capacity to be competitive and win that game. But it was about what led to those numbers. So Japan for that 2015, Eddie Jones had that group for about 18 months and led them up to that, where South Africa, Heineke Meyer, who had to apologise to the South African people for the loss, chose a B team. So the numbers meant that Japan was really competitive. So it's always about understanding context and what drove the overall understanding or cohesion or the ability to perform for those particular teams. So likewise, the islands of this world that was number one for a long period of time is essentially driven by the structure of Irish rugby, allows them to be highly cohesive over a long period of time. In a similar way, New Zealand rugby as well allows them to drive that level of cohesion just by the nature of the structure of it.
Yep. And that's, I suppose we'll jump onto Ireland now. I mean, that obviously a lot made of their quarterfinal exit, but like we mentioned previously, these are teams, they seem to be teams, at least from on face value, highly cohesive teams, strong structures in behind. And often in big games like that between the All Blacks and Ireland, it comes down to moments. Is that how you saw that game? And
yeah. And so there is a bit of a narrative about, Ireland not necessarily making out of the quarters and being a bit disappointing. But I think it's a little bit of a lazy argument because we know that the draw was, just by the nature of the draw, it was lopsided. And that a number of those quarterfinals in previous World Cups were basically as strong as semi-finals, just by the nature of the way the groups were done. So effectively, you could argue, and I would argue, based on the quality of the game, that the All Blacks Ireland game, likewise the South Africa-France game, were effectively the quality of semi-finals. And that those games were quite close and the numbers were quite close, and that it comes down to just the little bits of detail at the end. But to be competitive, you need the structure and the build to basically have that capacity at the end. Because if you don't have the cohesion, then you're not in that position. You'll never be in that position to basically be in that quarter or be in that semi or be in that final. That's where that last few little bits of percent make the difference. And in some cases, luck or just bad luck.
Yeah, well, that's right. And I guess what it probably highlights as well is that a team like Ireland, they go out in the quarterfinals, but there's a lot of upside given the systems they've built and the successes they've had as well outside of the World Cup. So one thing that sort of struck me, though, in some of the analysis, if you take the New South Wales Blues, for example, versus the Maroons, and I saw a line that over a 10-year period, the Maroons had something like 29 players rotated through. New South Wales had something like 68. So I wonder from a coaching perspective, when there are losses, is there a tendency to overreact to losses and then maybe underreact to wins?
Yeah, so we use a term, to be honest, I can't remember where we got it from, called action bias. So you lose, you feel like you have to make a change.
Yep.
So we know in the NRL that when a team loses, if they make more changes afterwards, the team has a worse ongoing winning percentage than a losing team that makes less changes going forward.
Yep.
Because what has to happen, combinations and teams are in the simplest form, are built, not found. So if you go and always try to find your team, if you're constantly trying to find your team, then you don't have the ability to build the overall level of understanding. And so the action bias or the overreacting to results creates that inability to develop that level of understanding. So really good example of that is, I mentioned Pat Ferguson, one of the original co-founders of Gainline. He did a great study with an AFL team of the coach's assessment of players with a win by less than a goal and a loss by less than a goal. So in the AFL, that's literally the ball touching a post or touching a finger. So less than 6 points or more than 6 points. What he found was that the coach's assessment of the players was if they won by less than 6 points, had a great game, did a wonderful job, you're awesome. Lost by less than 6 points, poor game, not very good, you've got to improve. So the disparity that was between winning essentially by a little bit of luck or losing by a little bit of luck on the perception of the players was actually massive. So this is actually by a professional coach. And so those biases are there. And so then those biases transfer into selection in that way. So sometimes for stability, you have to not make changes because the natural inclination of people is to make change. So sometimes for stability is often needed to build team understanding and team cohesion. We've got plenty of examples of teams that have got done for salary cap or they've been banned for trading or and they just naturally build and they get better over time.
Another example, I guess, or at least maybe it's a bad example, but France. So if we look at their run in the World Cup and the lead up to the World Cup, a couple of high-profile injuries. So how do you view that from an overall cohesion perspective? It just did seem like a couple of key areas. Obviously, they were impacted in terms of their ability to select Intermac, for example, Willemse from a locking perspective. But did that translate into any differences in cohesion in the numbers that you were seeing?
France always had the advantage this year because of home ground advantage. And we know teams that play at home have an advantage. There are plenty of studies out there, the influence of home crowd, etc., etc. France always have to get it right to be competitive. The nature of their system, I talk about system below, the nature of their system doesn't inherently allow France to build easily. The current France team, they made it easier for themselves, whether it's serendipity or through conscious competence. There's a lot of under-20s and a lot of Toulouse. Well, there was a lot of Toulouse in that group. So it built them that they were competitive enough, plus the fact that they had that home ground advantage that allowed them to perform quite well. The interesting thing to note is that they always tended to stick to combinations. So in the I can't remember in whether it was the last pool round. So their 9 and 10 combinations were coming out of Bordeaux. So they would look and always try and pick these combinations. So part of their strategy was they were always trying to think about it. But in the end, they weren't in the same level of sort of markers by the way we look at it, the way we measure it, as South Africa and New Zealand when it came to basically the top end. So they were competitive, but not as competitive as what I believe they needed to be truly competitive at the end of the tournament, which is the nature of their system. A caveat to that. So if they did have Intermac in there as well, they would have been better. And so that's the issue. When your system's not there, everything has to go right, and it didn't go right for them.
Yeah. Okay.
So they became fragile.
Yep. Now I want to look into the Springboks now. So obviously champions 2019, 2023. What I'm interested from a Springboks perspective is that sort of transition 2017 to 2018 to now. What is a successful run? Because if I think back, and this is just anecdotally, sort of watching games, disaster of results in 2017. Probably trying to adopt a style and system that, I don't know if it's a lazy term, but Springboks DNA was sort of getting away from that. And it seemed like some of the changes that Russie made when he came in was to revert back to a playing style they were more familiar with, and then sort of build on that in the lead up. And he speaks about 2019 being a bit of a bonus in terms of winning of a Rugby World Cup. I suppose a couple of questions, but do you see that system changes or reverting back have an impact on cohesion? What were the markers indicating in 2019 around cohesion, their ability to win that World Cup? And then how are they placed currently in terms of their run up to the 2023 World Cup?
So program is when we talk about cohesion, we talk about the 3 Ps: people, position, program, the relationship between people, the relationship to position or role, and the relationship to program. So understanding of, say, the game plan. So that's important. So if you change the way you're playing, that's going to have an impact. The advantage almost Rassie had in a way, I mean, you talk about, I think they lost by 50 odd points or 40 points to Ireland in 2017. Then you have this run. He basically, so the Springboks, they had the least turnover of squad. When I say the least turnover of squad, he used about, when in 2019 Rugby World Cup, I'm not 100% sure of the stats here, but he used about 80% of, so the players that played in 2019, he used about 80% of those on the way through to 2019. So it was almost like, okay, I've got 18 months. What's my group? This is my group. I'm going to stick with my group through that time. Now, ultimately, from my perspective and our view, Cohesion Analytics, I don't care how they play. It's a case of, do you have the capacity to play the way you want to play? You may have the best game plan in the world and the best ideas and the best players, but if you don't have the capacity, so Barbarians and British Irish Lions are a good example. British Irish Lions should win every game they ever play, because ultimately you should expect they are the best players because you are picking the cream of the crop. But we know they don't. They don't win as much as arguably they should. So basically, he was really stable in his group, and they had really good numbers come the 2019 Rugby World Cup, and come the final, 5 minutes in, England scrum change. There was a bit of, Ben can talk to some type 5 issues about left and right lock. And I talked about this before, England had better overall strength, but South Africa had more consistency of relationships with the group, so they could defend better. And that was their key. And the key to that was that 18-month period leading up to it. Plus the fact, and we bang on this about, and it was the same again. So in the final this year, 12 of that starting team wore a Western Province or a Stormers jersey through their journey through the professional ranks. So it's not necessarily about the Springboks. And obviously a lot of people talk about, those players have played overseas. Yes, they have played overseas, but they've played a shed load of games together and formed a lot of relationships within the Springboks, but also in that lead up to becoming a Springbok. That's a really important part of it. Like South Africa's got a really good system. Unfortunately, the system is blunted a little bit by the top layer constantly being taken away, but it's coming back at the moment. So them going to URC has changed the dynamic that a number of players seem to be coming back. And that could lead to domination from a South African perspective, because they're doing really well in the URC, and it comes down to they've got really good systems and structures sitting underneath that drives that.
So there's a few teams there we've touched on, and I suppose looking forward, you've just touched on the Springboks having strong systems. Ireland seem to be set up and built for success. France have, a very competitive professional league that they play off of. So there's a number of teams that have highly successful systems there. Where do you place the All Blacks on that if we just sort of crystal ball view forward?
So the All Blacks, the system in New Zealand has always had this beautiful triangle where it all points to that black jersey at the top. Yeah. But it's fundamentally driven by NPC. So I describe, whenever whenever I talk about social media, whenever I talk about the NPC, it's always the engine room of New Zealand rugby, because ultimately that's what drives professional rugby. NPC through to Super Rugby, through to the All Blacks. That the Super Rugby teams are driven by how they develop their talent through NPC, how they develop understanding, which is why the Crusaders. So the Crusaders have 2 PUs, provincial unions sitting underneath, and so do the Highlanders. But the Crusaders developed it and use it much more efficiently than the Highlanders do. And so it's about how you bring that talent through and develop that understanding. And when you have strong Super Rugby teams, you naturally develop a high or a strong provincial team. The New Zealand system is just shown how it works, but that's just one particular method. So if you're another country looking at, well, what can we do to improve, it doesn't necessarily mean you just model what they're doing in New Zealand. It's understanding the mechanism. What is the mechanism that drives cohesion into the national team? And then, okay, well, how do we apply that mechanism now? So, for example, in Ireland, the mechanism isn't a third tier. It's how the individual teams have their players coming through their various A programs and their juniors underneath in that way. So
yeah, interesting. It's a good place to, I think, wrap things up. So, because I think there's been a lot of talk about the NPC being not fit for purpose. I won't put you on the spot on what that means, but it tends to be sort of more a commercial side of things. I think is where that discussion is being had, and but certainly, we've always felt that the NPC as that engine room is a key part of New Zealand rugby. So you could almost argue it is fit for purpose.
Well, that's right, and I totally agree. It's what the definition of not fit for purpose. So it's going to be really interesting from our perspective, understanding what happens there, because it can go, if it's going to change, it can either go in 2 directions. It could either completely muck it up, or it can actually absolutely even optimize it further. In that way. So it's going to be really interesting to watch how that that progresses over time.
Yeah, how that plays out. Were there any surprises for you, or in other people's minds, surprises that came through as high cohesion markers in the World Cup, or any other famous examples you can refer to?
A really good case study for us is Chile. So yes, they didn't necessarily, but they're always going to struggle once they get there. But it's always a great case study, because Chile as a team is effectively run. Majority of those players come from one single club, Selknam, and so you get this. So they knocked the USA out of qualifiers, and so it's a good example of system versus system. USA very broad through the MLR. It was very difficult to get a group together and get that high level of understanding when you don't necessarily play a lot of games, versus a lot of those players had literally played 30 games together coming into those qualifiers. And so even though maybe pound for pound they're not as good, it doesn't necessarily matter. So Chile's a sort of a really good example of how you can basically get a small system working. I think Fijian Drua is a good example of what having alignment through, even though they've got obviously a lot of Europeans, but when you've got, previously it was almost this diaspora that would come together, but now there's this, it's almost like there is a program sitting underneath there, and there is alignment where the European-based players are coming back to. So there's more of alignment. I think that's showing up in the way they're playing, and their numbers are definitely better. And I think Japan, a little bit off the boil, is indicated. I talked about one of the strengths Eddie had previously with that Japan team in 2015 with that long lead in. They're not necessarily getting that long lead in anymore. So other than that, I had a ball. I mean, Michael Cheika with Argentina. I think Argentina, I talk about all those Western Stormers and all the Stormers and Western Province players in South Africa. There was, I think, 11 former Jaguares and Pampers 15. So I don't know if anyone's aware of Pampers 15, but they actually played in the Curry Cup or Vodacom Cup a whole bunch of years ago. So there's a core group that's come through. So all these sort of, signals around structure. But of course, I'm very biased. You asked me a question, I was always put my cohesion analytics lens on it. But but it was such a great tournament, and obviously I'm looking forward to it being here in Australia in 4 years. So
yeah, I think Australian rugby's got a lot to look forward to. There's the Lions tour in a couple of years, and then a Rugby World Cup in 4 years. So
yeah, I tell you what, I am looking forward to, but I'm also not looking forward to the Lions tour, because I was actually in the Wallabies coaching box for the last Lions tour, and I'm saying to myself, what, I cannot believe that was 12 years ago. Where has that time gone? So
yes, it goes quickly.
Yeah, it does go very quickly. But yeah, but that's always. But it's great atmosphere. It is like the Lions tour is still from a fan perspective, is just the pinnacle. So I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, a lot to look forward to. Simon, you've been very generous with your time, so I want to thank you for joining me today. There's a lot we covered and a lot I learned, actually, so really appreciate your time.
No worries, Zach. If people want to sort of reach out, so if they go to our website, www.gainline.biz, and down the bottom, all our social media links, and depending on your poison, on what social media you want to choose, and subscribe to our newsletter, which talks about some of the stuff we've just talked about in this, and get in touch if you want to know more.
Cool. Yeah, and I'll link all of that into the description, including some of the reports that I read that I found really interesting as well. So thanks again, Simon.
Thanks, Zach.